Chapter 3: Magic, Sacrifice, and Prayer. That fear first created the gods is perhaps as true as anything so brief could be on so great a subject. To recognize an external power, it is requisite that we should find the inner stream and tendency of life somehow checked or disturbed. If all went well and acceptably, we should attribute divinity only to ourselves. The external is therefore evil rather than good to early apprehension, a sentiment which still survives in respect to matter, for it takes reflection to conceive that external forces form a necessary environment, creating as well as limiting us, and offering us as many opportunities as rebuffs. The first things which a man learns to distinguish and respect are things with a will of their own, things which resist his casual demands, and so the first sentiment with which he confronts reality is a certain animosity, which becomes cruelty toward the weak, and fear and fawning before the powerful, toward men and animals, and the docile parts of nature. These sentiments soon become defined accurately, representing the exact degree of friendliness or use which we discover in these beings, and it is in practical terms expressing this relation to our interests that we define their characters. Much remains over, however, which we cannot easily define. Indomitable, ambiguous regions of nature and consciousness, which we know not how to face, yet we cannot ignore them, since it is thence that comes what is most momentous in our fortunes: luck, disease, tempest, death, victory. Thence come also certain mysterious visitations to the inner mind, dreams, apparitions, warnings. To perceive these things is not always easy, nor is it easy to interpret them, while the great changes in nature, which perhaps they forebode, may indeed be watched but cannot be met intelligently, much less prevented. The feeling with which primitive man walks the earth must accordingly be, for the most part, apprehension, and what he meets beyond the well-conned ways of his tribe and habitat can be nothing but formidable spirits. Impotence, however, has a more positive side. If the lightning and thunder, startling us in our peace, suddenly reveal unwelcome powers before which we must tremble, hunger, on the contrary, will torment us with floating ideas, intermittent impulses to act, suggesting things which would be wholly delightful if only we could find them, but which it becomes intolerable to remain without. In this case, our fear, if we still choose to call it so, would be lest our craving should remain unsatisfied, or rather fear has given place to need. We recognize our dependence on external powers, not because they threaten, but because they forsake us. Obvious considerations like these furnish the proof of God's existence, not as philosophers have tried to express it after the fact, and in relation to mythical conceptions of God already current, but as mankind originally perceived it, and, where religion is spontaneous, perceives it still. There is such an order in experience that we find our desires doubly dependent on something which, because it disregards our will, we call an external power. Sometimes it overwhelms us with scourges and wonders, so that we must marvel at it and fear. Sometimes it removes, or after removing, restores the support necessary to our existence and happiness, so that we must cling to it, hope for it, and love it. Whatever is serious in religion, whatever is bound up with morality and fate, is contained in those plain experiences of dependence and of affinity to that on which we depend. To rest in poetry or mythical philosophy, which definitions, not warranted in the end by experience, are given to that power which experience reveals. To reject such arbitrary definitions is called atheism by those who frame them, but a man who studies for himself the ominous and the friendly aspects of reality and gives them the truest and most adequate expression he can is repeating what the founders of religion did in the beginning. He is their companion and follower more truly than are the apologists for second-hand conceptions which these apologists themselves have never compared with the facts, and which they prize chiefly for misrepresenting actual experience, giving it imaginary extensions. Religion is not essentially an imposture, though it might seem so if we consider it as its defenders presented to us, rather than as its discoverers and original spokesmen uttered it in the presence of nature and face to face with unsophisticated men. Religion is an interpretation of experience, honestly made and made in view of man's happiness and its empirical conditions. That this interpretation is poetical goes without saying, since natural and moral science, even today, are inadequate for the task. But the mythical form into which men cast their wisdom was not chosen by them because they preferred to be imaginative. It was not embraced as its survivals are now defended, out of sentimental attachment to grandiloquent but inaccurate thoughts. Mythical forms were adopted because none other were available, nor could the primitive mind discriminate at all between the mythical and the scientific. Whether it is the myth or the wisdom it expresses that we call religion is a matter of words. Certain it is that the wisdom is alone what gives the myth its dignity and what originally suggested it. God's majesty lies in his operation, not in his definition or his image. Fear and need, then, bring us into the presence of external powers, conceived mythically, whose essential character is to be now terrible, now auspicious. The influence is real and directly felt. The gods' function is unmistakable and momentous, while their name and form, the fabulous beings to which that felt influence is imputed, vary with the resources of the worshipper's mind and his poetic habits. The work of expression, the creation of a fabulous environment to derive experience from, is not, however, the first or most pressing operation employing the religious mind. Its first business is rather the work of propitiation. Before we stop to contemplate the deity, we hasten to appease it, to welcome it, or to get out of its way. Quote precedes fable and helps to frame it, because the feeling of need or fear is a practical feeling, and the ideas it may awaken are only incidental to the reactions it prompts. Worship is therefore earlier and nearer to the roots of religion than dogma is. At the same time, since those reactions which are directly efficacious go to form arts and industrial habits, and eventually put before us the world of science and common sense, religious practice and thought are confined to the sphere in which direct manipulation of things is possible. Cultus is always distinguishable from industry, even when the worshipper's motives are most sordid and his notions most material. For in religious operations, the changes worked or expected can never be traced consecutively. There is a break, often a complete diversity and disproportion between effort and result. Religion is a form of rational living, more empirical, looser, more primitive than art. Man's consciousness in it is more immersed in nature, nearer to a vegetative union with the general life. It bemoans division and celebrates harmony with a more passive and lyrical wonder. The element of action proper to religion is extremely arbitrary, and we are often at a loss to see in what way the acts recommended conduce at all to the result foretold. As theoretical superstition stops at any cause, so practical superstition seizes on any means. Religion arises under high pressure. In the last extremity, everyone appeals to God. But in the last extremity, all known methods of action have proved futile. When resources are exhausted and ideas fail, if there is still vitality in the will, it sends a supreme appeal to the supernatural. This appeal is necessarily made in the dark. It is the appeal of a conscious impotence, of an avowed perplexity. What a man in such a case may come to do to propitiate the deity, or to produce by magic a result he cannot produce by art, will obviously be some random action. He will be driven back to the place where instinct and reason begin. His movement will be absolutely experimental, altogether spontaneous. He will have no reason for what he does, save that he must do something. What he will do, however, will not be very original. A die must fall on some one of its six faces. Shake it as much as you please. When Don Quixote, seeking to do good, absolutely at a venture, let the reins drop on Roxanante's neck, the poor beast very naturally fall the highway, and a man, wondering what will please heaven, and ultimately light on nothing but what might please himself. It is pathetic to observe how lowly the motives are that religion, even the highest, attributes to the deity, and from what a hard-pressed and bitter existence they have been drawn, to be given the best morsel, to be remembered, to be praised, to be obeyed blindly and punctiliously. These have been thought points of honor with the gods, for which they would dispense favors and punishments on the most exorbitant scale. Indeed, the widespread practice of sacrifice, like all mutilations and penances, suggests an even meaner jealousy and malice in the gods, for the disciplinary functions which these things may have were not aimed at in the beginning, and would not have associated them particularly with religion. In setting aside the fat for the gods' pleasure, in sacrificing the firstborn, and a thousand other cruel ceremonies, the idea apparently was that an envious onlooker, lurking unseen, might poison the whole, or revenge himself for not having enjoyed it, unless a part, possibly sufficient for his hunger, were surrendered to him voluntarily. This onlooker was a veritable demon, treated as a man treats a robber to whom he yields his purse that his life may be spared. To call the gods envious has a certain symbolic truth in that earthly fortunes are actually precarious, and such an observation might inspire detachment from material things and a kind of philosophy. But what at first inspires sacrifice is a literal envy imputed to the gods, a spirit of vengeance and petty ill will, so that they grudge a man even the good things which they cannot enjoy themselves. If the god is a tyrant, the votary will be a taxpayer, surrendering his tithes to secure immunity from further levies or from attack by other potentates. God and man will be natural enemies, living in a sort of politic peace. Sacrifices are far from having merely this sinister meaning. Once inaugurated, they suggest further ideas, and from the beginning, they had happier associations. The sacrifice was incidental to a feast, and the plenty it was to render safe existed already. What was a bribe offered in the spirit of barter to see if the envious power could not be mollified by something less than the total ruin of its victims, could easily become a genial distribution of what custom assigned to each. So much to the chief, so much to the god, so much to the husbandman. There is a certain openness, and, as it were, the form of justice, in giving each what is conventionally his due, however little he may really deserve it. In religious observances, this sentiment plays an important part, and men find satisfaction in fulfilling in a seemly manner what is prescribed. And since they know little about the ground or meaning of what they do, they feel content and safe if at least they have done it properly. Sacrifices are often performed in this spirit, and when a beautiful order and religious calm have come to dignify the performance, the mind, having meantime very little to occupy it, may embroider on the given theme. It is then that fable and new religious sentiments suggested by fate appear prominently on the scene. In agricultural rites, for instance, sacrifice will naturally be offered to the deity presiding over germination, that is, the deity that might, perhaps, withdraw his favor with disastrous results. He commonly proves, however, a kindly and responsive being, and in offering to him a few sheaves of corn, some barley cakes, or a libation from the vintage, the public is grateful rather than calculating. The sacrifice has become an act of thanksgiving. So, in Christian devotion, which often follows primitive impulses, repeats the dialectic of paganism in a more speculative region, redemption did not remain merely expiatory. It was not merely a debt to be paid off and a certain quantum of suffering to be endured, which had induced the Son of God to become man and to take up his cross. It was, so the subtler theologians declared, an act of affection as much as of pity, and the spell of the doctrine over the human heart lay in feeling that God wished to assimilate himself to man, rather than simply from above to declare him forgiven, so that the incarnation was in effect a rehabilitation of man, a redemption in itself, and a forgiveness. Men like to think that God has sat at their table and walked among them in disguise. This idea is flattering. It suggests that the courtesy may someday be returned, and for those who can look so deep, it expresses pointedly the philosophical truth of the matter. For are not the gods, too, in eternal travail after their ideal? And is not man a part of the world, and his art a portion of the divine wisdom? If the incarnation was a virtual redemption, the truest incarnation was the laborious creation itself. If sacrifice, in its more amiable aspect, can become thanksgiving and an expression of profitable dependence, it can suffer an even nobler transformation while retaining all its austerity. Renunciation is the cornerstone of wisdom. the condition of all genuine achievement. The gods, in asking for a sacrifice, may invite us to give up not a part of our food or of our liberty, but the foolish and inordinate part of our wills. The sacrifice may be dictated to us not by a jealous enemy needing to be pacified, but by a far seeing friend wishing we may not be deceived. If what we are commanded to surrender is only what is doing us harm, the God demanding the sacrifice is our own ideal. He has no interest in the case other than our own. He is no part of the environment. He is the goal that determines for us how we should proceed in order to realize, as far as possible, our inmost aspirations. When religion reaches this phase, it has become thoroughly moral. It has ceased to represent or misrepresent material conditions and has learned to embody spiritual goods. Sacrifice is right, and rights can seldom be made to embody ideas exclusively moral. Something dramatic or mystical will cling to the performance, and even when the effect of it is to purify, it will bring about an emotional catharsis rather than a moral improvement. The Mass is a ritual sacrifice, and the communion is a part of it, having the closest resemblance to what sacrifices have always been. Among the devout, these ceremonies and the lyric emotions they awaken have a quite visible influence, but the spell is mystic. The god soon recedes, and it would be purely fanciful to maintain that any permanent moral effect comes from such an exercise. The Church has felt as much and introduced the confession, where a man may really be asked to consider what sacrifices he should make for his part, and in what practical direction he should imagine himself to be drawn by the vague Dionysiac influences to which the ritual subjects him. As sacrifice expresses fear, prayer expresses need. Common sense thinks of language as something meant to be understood by another and to produce changes in his disposition and behavior. But language has pre rational uses, of which poetry and prayer are perhaps the chief. A man overcome by passion assumes dramatic attitudes, surely not intended to be watched or interpreted. Like tears, gestures may touch an observer's heart, but they do not come for that purpose. So the fund of words and phrases, latent in the mind, flow out under stress of emotion. They flow because they belong to the situation, because they fill out and complete a perception absorbing the mind. They do not flow primarily to be listened to. The instinct to pray is one of the chief avenues to the deity, and the form prayer takes helps immensely to define the power it is addressed to. Indeed, it is in the act of praying that men formulate to themselves what God must be, and tell him at great length what they believe and what they expect of him. The initial forms of prayer are not so absurd as the somewhat rationalized forms of it. Unlike sacrifice, prayer seems to be justified by its essence and to be degraded by the transformations it suffers in reflection. When men try to find a place for it in their cosmic economy, for its essence is poetical, expressive, contemplative, and it grows more and more nonsensical the more people insist on making it a prosaic commercial exchange of views between two interlocutors. Prayer is a soliloquy. By being a soliloquy, expressing need, and being furthermore, like sacrifice, a desperate expedient which men fly to in their impotence to look for an effect, to cry aloud, to make vows, to contrast eloquently the given with the ideal situation, is certainly as likely a way of bringing about a change for the better as it would be to chastise oneself severely, or to destroy what one loves best, or to perform acts altogether trivial and arbitrary. Prayer also is magic, and as such, is expected to do work. The answer looked for, or one which may be accepted instead, very often ensues, and it is then that mythology begins to enter in and seeks to explain what machinery of divine passions and purposes that answering effect was produced. Magic is, in a certain sense, the mother of art, art being the magic that succeeds and can establish itself. For this very reason, mere magic is never appealed to when art has been found, and no unsophisticated man prays to have that done for him which he knows how to do for himself. When his art fails, if his necessity still presses, he appeals to magic, and he prays when he no longer can control the event, provided this event is momentous to him. Prayer is not a substitute for work, it is a desperate effort to work further and to be efficient beyond the range of one's powers. It is not the lazy who are most inclined to prayer, those pray most who care most, and who, having worked hard, find it intolerable to be defeated. No chapter in theology is more unhappy than that in which a material efficacy is assigned to prayer. In the first place, the facts contradict the notion that curses can bring evil or blessings can cure, and it is not observed that the most orthodox and hard praying army wins the most battles. The facts, however, are often against theology, which has to rely on dialectical refinements to explain them away. But unfortunately, in this instance, dialectic is no less hostile than experience. God must know our necessities before we ask, and, if He is good, must already have decided what He would do for us. Prayer, like every other act, becomes, in a providential world, altogether perfunctory and histrionic. We are compelled to go through it. It is set down for us in the play, but it lacks altogether that moral value which we assign to it. When our prayers fail, it must be better than if they had succeeded, so that prayer, with all free preference whatsoever, becomes an absurdity. The truth is much deeper than that which so many people find in determinism. A physical predetermination in making all things necessary leaves all values entire, and my preferences, though they cannot be efficacious unless they express preformed natural forces, are not invalidated ideally. It is still true that the world would have been better to all eternity if my will also could have been fulfilled. A providential optimism, on the contrary, not merely predetermines events, but discounts values, and it reduces every mortal aspiration, every pang of conscience, every wish that things should be better than they are, to a blind impertinence, nay, to a sacrilege. Thus, you may not pray that God's kingdom may come, but only what is not a prayer, but a dogma, that it has come already. The mythology that pretends to justify prayer by giving it a material efficacy misunderstands prayer completely and makes it ridiculous, for it turns away from the heart, which prayer expresses pathetically, to a fabulous cosmos, where aspirations have been turned into things and have thereby stifled their own voices. The situation would not be improved if we surrendered that mystical optimism and maintained that prayer might really attract superhuman forces to aid by giving them a signal without which they would not have been able to reach us. If experience lent itself to such a theory, there would be nothing in it more impossible than an ordinary telepathy. Prayer would then be an art like conversation, and the exact personages and interests would be discoverable to which we might appeal. A celestial diplomacy might then be established, not very unlike primitive religions. Religion would have reverted to industry and science, to which the grosser spirits that take refuge under it have always wished to assimilate it. But is it really the office of religion to work upon external powers and extract from them calculable effects? Is it an art like empiric medicine and merely a dubious and mystic industry? If so, it exists only by imperfection. Were it better developed, it would coincide with those material and social arts with which it is identical in essence. Successful religion, like successful magic, would have passed into the art of exploiting the world. What successful religion really should pass into is contemplation, ideality, poetry, in the sense in which poetry includes all imaginative moral life. That this is what religion looks to is very clear in prayer and in the efficacy which prayer consistently can have. In rational prayer, the soul may be said to accomplish three things important to its welfare. It withdraws within itself and defines its good, it accompanies itself to destiny, and it grows like the ideal which it conceives. If prayer springs from need, it will naturally dwell on what would satisfy that necessity. Sometimes, indeed, it does nothing else but articulate and eulogize what is most wanted and prized. This object will often be particular, and so it should be, since Socrates' prayer for the best would be perfunctory and vapid indeed in a man whose life had not been spent, like Socrates, in defining what the best was. Yet any particular good lies in a field of relations. It has associates and implications, so that the mind dwelling on it and invoking its presence will naturally be enticed also into its background and will wonder there, perhaps to come upon greater goods or upon evils which the coveted good would make inevitable. An earnest consideration, therefore, of anything desired is apt to enlarge and generalize aspiration till it embraces an ideal life. For from almost any starting point, the limits and contours of mortal happiness are soon descried. Prayer, inspired by a pressing need, already relieves its importunity by merging it in the general need of the spirit and of mankind. It therefore calms the passions in expressing them, like all idealization, and tends to make the will comfortable with reason and justice. A comprehensive ideal, however, is harder to realize than a particular one. The rain wished for may fall, the death feared may be averted, but the kingdom of heaven does not come. It is in the very essence of prayer to regard a denial as possible. There would be no sense in defining and begging for the better thing if that better thing had at any rate to be. The possibility of defeat is one of the circumstances with which meditation must square the ideal. Seeing that my prayer may not be granted, what, in that case, should I pray for next? Now the order of nature is in many respects well known. and it is clear that all realizable ideals must not transgress certain bounds. The practical ideal, that which under the circumstances it is best to aim at and pray for, will not rebel against destiny. Conformity is an element in all religion and submission in all prayer, not because what must be is best, but because the best that may be pursued rationally lies within the possible and can be hatched only in the general womb of being. The prayer, thy will be done, if it is to remain a prayer, must not be degraded from its original meaning, which was that an unfulfilled ideal should be fulfilled. It expressed aspiration after the best, not willingness to be satisfied with anything. Yet the inevitable must be accepted, and it is easier to change the human will than the laws of nature. To wean the mind from extravagant desires and teach it to find excellence in what life affords, when life is made as worthy as possible, is a part of wisdom and religion. Prayer, by confronting the ideal with experience and fate, tends to render that ideal humble, practical, and efficacious. A sense for human limitations, however, has its foil in the ideal of deity, which is nothing but the ideal of man freed from those limitations which a humble and wise man accepts for himself, but which a spiritual man never ceases to feel as limitations. Man, for instance, is mortal, and his whole animal and social economy is built on that fact, so that his practical ideal must start on that basis and make the best of it. But immortality is essentially better, and the eternal is in many ways constantly present to a noble mind. The gods, therefore, are immortal, and to speak their language in prayer is to learn to see all things as they do, and, as reason must, under the form of eternity. The gods are furthermore no respecters of persons. They are just, for it is man's ideal to be so. Prayer, since it addresses deity, will, in the end, blush to be selfish and partial. The majesty of the divine mind, envisaged and consulted, will tend to pass into the human mind. This use of prayer has not been conspicuous in Christian times, because instead of assimilating the temporal to the eternal, men have assimilated the eternal to the temporal, being perturbed fanatics in religion rather than poets and idealists. Pagan devotion, on the other hand, was full of this calmer spirit. The gods, being frankly natural, could be truly ideal. They embody what was fairest in life and loved men who resembled them, so that it was delightful and ennobling to see their images everywhere, and to keep their names and story perpetually in mind. They did not, by their influence, alienate man from his appropriate happiness, but they perfected it by their presence, peopling all places, changing their forms as all living things must, according to place and circumstance. They showed how all kinds of being, if perfect in their kind, might be perfectly good. They asked for a reference consistent with reason, and exercised prerogatives that let man free. Their worship was a perpetual lesson in humanity, moderation, and beauty. Something pre-rational and monstrous often peeped out behind their serenity, as it does beneath the human soul, and there was certainly no lack of wildness and mystic horror in their apparitions. The ideal must needs betray those elemental forces on which, after all, it rests. But reason exists to exercise their madness and win them over to a steady expression of themselves and of the good. Prayer, in fine, though it accomplishes nothing material, constitutes something spiritual. It will not bring rain, but until rain comes, it may cultivate hope and resignation, and may prepare the heart for any issue, opening up a vista in which human prosperity will appear in its conditioned existence and conditional value. A candle, wasting itself before an image, will prevent no misfortune, but it may bear witness to some silent hope or relieve some sorrow by expressing it. It may soften a little the bitter sense of impotence which would consume a mind aware of physical dependence, but not of spiritual dominion. Worship, supplication, reliance on the gods express both these things in appropriate parable. Physical impotence is expressed by man's appeal for help, moral dominion by belief in God's omnipotence. This belief may afterwards seem to be contradicted by events. It would be so in truth if God's omnipotence stood for a material magical control of events by the values they were to generate. But the believer knows in his heart, in spite of the confused explanations he may give of his feelings, that a material efficacy is not the test of his faith. His faith will survive any outward disappointment. In fact, it will grow by that discipline and not become truly religious until it ceases to be a foolish expectation of improbable things and rises on stepping stones of its material disappointments into a spiritual peace. What would sacrifice be but a risky investment if it did not redeem us from the love of those things which it asks us to surrender? What would be the miserable fruit of an appeal to God which, after bringing us face to face with Him, left us still immersed in what we could have enjoyed without Him? The real use and excuse for magic is this, that by enticing us in the service of natural lusts into a region above natural instrumentalities, it accustoms us to that rarer atmosphere, so that we may learn to breathe it for its own sake. By the time we discover the mechanical futility of religion, we may have begun to blush at the thought of using religion mechanically. For what should be the end of life if friendship with the gods is a means only? When thaumaturgy is discredited, the childish desire to work miracles may itself have passed away. Before we weary of the attempt to hide and piece out our mortality, our concomitant immortality may have dawned upon us. While we are waiting for the command to take up our bed and walk, we may hear a voice saying, "Thy sins are forgiven thee."